Any for your thoughts?
Wrap it up, fuzzball.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this panel at DragonCon, which is Star Wars at DragonCon. We're going to be talking about the movies that made Star Wars. I'm going to be participating in and facilitating the conversation. My name's Brian Young. I have been writing about Star Wars and cinema for a long time. I started the Cinema Behind Star Wars column at starwars.com in 2012 and have since moved that over to /film and do that regularly still. And I do the Full of Sith podcast, among other things. And then we've got a really great panel here for you now to have this conversation. And they're going to introduce themselves one at a time. And we're going to start with Amy. If you want to start, introduce yourself. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Amy Rickow, and I have a website called 365 Star Wars, which is the home of the 365 Star Wars Women Project. And I write about Star Wars for starwars.com, and as of this November, Star Wars Insider.
Then Hui Chen.
Hi, I'm Hui Chen Bui. I'm a writer and critic for /film.com, which runs Brian's column. And I'm the co-host of a podcast called The Millennial Falcon, which actually isn't just Star Wars. It's just geek and pop culture news. And I'm excited to be here.
Kai?
Hello, I'm Kai Charles. I'm a book reviewer and part of Fangirls Growing Rogue, our Fab Five group of fangirls.
And then Marie Claire.
Hi, I'm Marie Claire, and I am the host and runner of What the Force. I have a very meta Star Wars podcast and also now a website where we do meta articles and reviews all about Star Wars.
So the first question I want to kind of pose to everybody is really like, what piece of classic cinema did Star Wars really turn you on to? And I had a whole bunch of them, and I remember very clearly reading the piece in Alec Guinness's autobiography where he had like this super Star Wars fan come up to him and say like, I really love you. I've seen Star Wars. I've watched it like 30 times. And Alec Guinness like kind of told the kid like, please never watch it again. And he kind of talked about how, like, he wanted the kid to watch, like, he was afraid the kid would never see any of the other great Alec Guinness performances. And, like, reading that made me go explore more Alec Guinness, right? Like, I found, like, David Lean films and the Ealing Studios comedies and things like that because I was like, I don't want to disappoint Alec Guinness because he was still alive at that time. Not that I would ever meet him to actually disappoint him, or even, like, Kurosawa or whatever, like, really getting into Kurosawa because I found like a random VHS at the library that said like Hidden Fortress, the movie that inspired Star Wars. And I was like maybe 10 at the time. And I'm like, if it inspired Star Wars, I have to take it home now and watch that. So I'm curious, like what things Star Wars turned all of you on to, and you can just jump in and just, we'll take it one at a time. But I really love hearing what Star
For my part, growing up with Star Wars, my father actually was really into showing me the Star Wars influences. So I loved Star Wars, and he showed me Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress when I was a little kid. And I saw Metropolis when I was a little kid, which also has a lot of influence, especially like how C-3PO looks. Casablanca from like, you know, how Tatooine looks. It was kind of just part of my, I don't know, weird home education to explore the classic cinema. And now with the podcast, it's pushed me into exploring, 2187, The Searchers, revisiting Hidden Fortress after 20 plus years to take a look at it. Flash Gordon, kind of all of the things that really inspired Lucas, but also then looking at Lucas's previous films, because I was really, really interested in do his messages also filter into like American Graffiti and THX? Like, yeah.
Well, I really fell in love with Star Wars when I was 10 and Return of the Jedi came out. And that was also around the same time that I discovered classic movies. And I'm of the age where you discovered them from cable or you went to the video store. I probably saw the same Hidden Fortress case that Brian was talking about. And, in all the behind the scenes, I was devouring all the behind the scenes material about Star Wars. And they talked so much about what these films were. And so I kind of created a list, and it really becomes a little mini film school, because once you kind of dive into Kurosawa, which I believe was probably the first foreign films I ever saw. And I think I saw them much younger than I would have otherwise, just because I was like, oh, they're related to Star Wars. Like, what's going on? I wasn't really interested in Westerns, but I ended up watching a whole bunch of John Ford Westerns and taking different things from them, good and bad. And the first time I saw The Bridge Over the River Kwai was absolutely because Alec Guinness was in it. So I suppose you might be kind of happy about that, because that was the inspiration for that, my first viewing of that.
For me, I think the first thing was American Graffiti, because you just wanted to know more about George, and then also his student film, TK. I'm really bad. I can't remember it right now. But also because I'm a huge reader, I also went to the Flash Gordon comics a long time ago. And Star Wars actually got me reading other types of science fiction. I never went down the science fiction aisle until Star Wars, and that led me to Dune. And cinematically, I was on the edge where I was getting into the Hammer horror films. And so, of course, then I had to find all of Peter Cushing's work, and just spent years just watching everything he's done, from horror to his time as Sherlock Holmes. And it's just been fun, all the different little trails you can take. Watch the Kurosawa film, which I think makes me a bad Star Wars fan.
I was going to say there's no such thing as a bad Star Wars fan, but it's impossible to be a bad Star Wars fan if the only thing you've done, you're not harassing anybody because you haven't seen a Kurosawa film.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually came to Star Wars kind of late. I watched the films, the original trilogy, around the time I was in high school, around 9th grade, and I just kind of found copies online. I can't say if they were legal or not, but don't pirate movies, kids. Anyways, I watched all of them, and actually came at an interesting time, because at that time I was reading a lot of kind of books that were influenced by Joseph Conrad's hero's journey. And it just watching Star Wars at the time really struck me those parallels, and I was really into Ursula Le Guin and Wizard of Earthsea at that time. So that kind of helped expand, I guess, my literary perceptions of the story beats that Star Wars follows. And of course, I went into a lot of Akira Kurosawa following my entry into the Star Wars canon.
I feel like people getting into Kurosawa because of Star Wars is a pretty common theme, and the first time I was beyond privileged to meet George Lucas, I think that was sort of what I was able to babble out to him, was I really want to thank you for introducing me to Kurosawa through Star Wars. I think I said it intelligibly, but I'm not sure.
But I really want to, sorry to interrupt, but
no, you're fine.
Highlight that Kurosawa films are highly entertaining. If you're not a fan of foreign film, if that's not something that if you feel intimidated by the subtitles, or that it's older, it's black and white, they're hilarious and they're adventurous and they're really, really fun films to watch. So they're not, some highfalutin kind of, fancy, foreign film. They are, he was heavily inspired by John Ford, and it shows. They are really, really great films to start with, if this is your first kind of foray into foreign films.
No, absolutely. I think Hidden Fortress is a great film for that, and I was really glad that was my first Kurosawa film, because it's so fun. And it's interesting that Lucas will say no, there's a couple of similarities, but he was way more inspired by Seven Samurai. But the similarities from Hidden Fortress are so important to Star Wars, the worm's eye view of the two peasants filling in as the droids. And then I think Phantom Menace actually is more inspired by Hidden Fortress than A New Hope is, personally. So you've got the general behind enemy lines trying to take the the queen or the princess, as it were, with her handmaiden decoy. Like I think Phantom Menace has much more hidden fortress than A New Hope does.
Yeah, it's sprinkled throughout kind of the saga, like especially there's a lot of in the fight between the good general and the bad general. There's a lot of that in A New Hope, like that specific fight. And then also there's a lot of the cinematic, like how the sort of action and riding on horses looks a lot like speeder bike travel. There's a lot of that. How gutsy the princess is and like just very tough is very Leia. There's, the peasants themselves, there's a lot of like, the banter and everything like that. But yeah, I can definitely see that it's sprinkled kind of it's pulled out in different ways, I think, in the saga.
Yeah, like to your point, like I think Toshiro Mifune's character, General Makabe, the scenes where he's riding on horseback with the just the foliage in black and white speeding behind him looks very much like speeder chases, or even like the Death Star, right? Like the Death Star,
like this Death Star run
color palette. Yeah. It's such good stuff. Any other Kurosawa films we want to talk about while we stopped into Kurosawa? I know we'd mentioned before we recorded Rashomon. We might as well get into that now.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to.
I mean, Ryan specifically talked about the unreliable narrative of the three kind of Rashomon testimonies that happen and how that tied into The Last Jedi with, the original Luke story, Ben Solo, Kylo Ren's story to Rey, and then back again to what we hope is kind of closer to the truth with Luke's kind of end confession. And I think that that's very powerful because we've never really seen a real example until that point of unreliable narrative in Star Wars and how it played out, as well as flashbacks. That was a big change from a story perspective. And, it came from Kurosawa and was influenced on Rian Johnson. And I think it's an amazing add to that movie to really give us like who's telling the truth and what is the truth.
I would argue that Obi-Wan was a big liar from the beginning, though. Like that was, he's the most unreliable of the narrators.
Fair. But like actually visually seen it.
Yeah.
If you watch Obi-Wan's body language too, as I kept watching, I'm like, this guy's lying. Like it's totally like cinematically, he won't look Luke in the eye. Yeah. He's just kind of like,
Alec, how did
it's
you
really
get
interesting
there?
how. Yeah, because those are cinematic hallmarks, too, of watching people's body language to learn about their characters. And every time I watch episode 4, I'm like, wow, it's all there in Alex's body language. He's totally lying to this kid.
I think Throne of Blood, which is another Kurosawa film, is a good one to watch just because it has a lot to do with prophecies. It has a lot to do with the idea of the apprentice killing the master to take over and just kind of being tortured by the idea of how a prophecy seems great, like you're like, oh, you're coming in to save the day, but how it can really just mentally mess with people's minds. And, people who might have gone on to lead good lives can be destroyed by them. So I think that when you see it, like I think that a lot of people think that like the movies that inspired Star Wars, it's like he copied it, like it's exactly the same, but so much more. It's like taking a little idea of the narrative structure or how you use locations or how you fill the frame, how you edited, like what the pace of it is, what do you show, what do you not show? Like that really is more to me what's interesting than like the direct comparisons.
My two favorite Throne of Blood things are, for one, like I think the structure, like you're saying, of Throne of Blood, of the character Toshiro Mifune plays, like his wife sort of just whispering evil in his ear like Palpatine, and there's so much in Revenge of the Sith like that. But the other is at the beginning of Throne of Blood. I mean, Throne of Blood is sort of a remake itself of Shakespeare's Macbeth, and the witch's hut. The way the camera moves in and then it disappears as it pulls back out, that camera trickery is the same thing Rian Johnson was doing in Last Jedi when the hut explodes. Like it's the same sort of
that
cinematic
same
trick.
movement. Yeah.
That hut
interesting
scene
stuff.
scared me when I was a kid. I saw it too early because like with the mist and the evil, like, you know, witch. And then I did not care for that the first time I saw it.
There's also
Speaking of
sorry, go ahead.
Kurosawa films that were adaptations of Shakespeare, I think Ran is a great mention in this because Kurosawa is often associated with his black and white films, but Ran is such a hyper-saturated, beautifully filmed, colorful film. And I think that use of color and especially the red in that film played a big inspiration on Rian Johnson's overall aesthetic in Last Jedi as well.
Totally. I think it would be worth mentioning Kagemusha as well, which is the Kurosawa's 1980 film that George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola actually produced because of like the popularity of Star Wars and Godfather. They like Kurosawa wasn't working and they were like, why not? And it turned out because he was really difficult. And they're like, well, we'll just force you into producing this. And they produced Kagemusha and it was his first color film and it like paved the way for Ron. But I really love how it got remade in Clone Wars. And we're going to talk about cartoons later, but Kagemusha translates literally to the Shadow Warrior, and the episodes called Shadow Warrior and Clone Wars have a lot of similarities, and they cast sort of Jar Jar as the Shadow Warrior, which is, it's always good. But that movie is really good too, and it's like, what do you owe? I think a lot of the stuff with the clones you can look at in Kagemusha, right? Like, what do you owe this army and the Jedi as well? What do you owe these people after you've given your service and you're not worth anything to them anymore, right? Which is really one of the huge themes of that movie. And you can look at the Jedi after Order 66, or you can look at the clones sort of trying to find their way in the galaxy with that. I really like that movie. I really like all the Kurosawa movies, really. There's not one I'm just like, no, not good. They're all, I haven't met one I haven't liked. And did anybody else want to talk about any other Kurosawa films, and we can kind of hit the next thing?
I mean, just Seven Samurai and how how the Jedi are very samurai-like, and especially the Order and some of the relationships in there are very paralleled with some of the characters.
Yeah, no, some of the great moments too. Like I love that moment on the speeder in Revenge of the Sith where Yoda's telling Mace Windu about how the prophecy could have been misread, and he's sort of patting his hair back, and the animator said that it was a direct nod to Takashi Shimura's character Kanbei Shimada in Seven Samurai, because he had to shave his head to save that kid from the bandit, and so he was always kind of doing that with his hair. But I love how they've sprinkled so much Seven Samurai throughout Star Wars. Like I mean, they remade it a couple of times. Like the first expanded universe story other than Splinter of the Mind's Eye was the Marvel comic that was Han Solo in the middle of a retelling of Seven Samurai in the Marvel comics. That was like the first story they told after the Star Wars adaptation was over. So like Seven Samurai's DNA has been in Star Wars from like the get-go. So the next thing we can talk about, I think it might be fun to talk about Hammer horror films too. I really love Peter Cushing and Count Dooku, Christopher Lee, who is also like really integral to Hammer horror films, which is one of my favorite things about the book Tarkin, that James Luceno was able to get a scene with Tarkin and Dooku together, and it was like kind of framed like a Hammer horror film scene, just that one scene. So I really like that stuff. But like any other stuff like that you all want to talk about?
I wonder if just the fact that British horror films and British actors, if that their persona of how they carry themselves and how they move through scenes, if that kind of reflected how George wrote Dooku, and wondering if on set they pretty much directed theirself from their British tradition, or how much of that was George directing them from having those as his influences. Because the British kind of, the British royalty that's in Star Wars films, I would include Ewan McGregor, they bring a type of body movement and carrying themselves that I often wondered if that was George's interpretation for them or what they brought personally to Star Wars. So that's a question I've always wondered.
I know that he cast Christopher Lee because he was Dracula, and there was a lot of Dracula parallels in how he wrote the character. And then Kevin Scott took that forward, and there's like some very Dracula-esque things that happen later on in Dooku Jedi Lost. So I think it's all just like a big sandbox that they're all kind of playing in and enjoying the history.
So one of the other things that I was curious about is the idea that like knowing a film that Star Wars is referencing is going to aid in your enjoyment of Star Wars. And this is like, I really find this true with like The Searchers specifically, like you were saying earlier, Amy, where it's just like he's not just copying things, and although there are shots directly from The Searchers in there, but when Cliegg Lars tells his story and you're like, oh, he's telling The Searchers, and he compacts that 2-hour movie into the next 15 minutes of Star Wars, knowing The Searchers, it allows you to kind of take all of your feelings from this. I think this is part of why I'm softer on Attack of the Clones than most people. It's like it takes all the feelings I get from having watched The Searchers and it just cross applies them to Star Wars. Like, are there any other moments where you've experienced this where like your knowledge of a film beforehand has aided in your enjoyment of Star Wars as you've watched it?
So,
wow. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Just from Attack of the Clones, I want to add on the Attack of the Clones love. My love of film noir and like my understanding of it growing throughout watching Attack of the Clones, and then like remembering, oh, hey, that is film noir, especially, Maltese Falcon and, Sunset Boulevard, like understanding that that's what they're trying to go for is that uneasiness with institutions and, that pre-war anxiety that we get in Casablanca, and just kind of understanding the genre more makes me understand what is fundamentally going on in Attack of the Clones. We have the hard-boiled detective in Obi-Wan Kenobi, and literally they go into a nightclub and he goes to the diner to get information. It helps me understand the under the surface paranoia that is all throughout Attack of the Clones, and like it absolutely makes me love it more, on top of all of the great Searchers like revenge and anxiety and hate too that Anakin goes through. There's so much in Attack of the Clones, and I could go on and on about it, but I won't.
We could have done another panel on just Attack of the Clones, and maybe we should. Yeah. Brandy, did anybody else want to jump in on that question though?
I was just going to say with The Searchers that to me, The Searchers is, I love that movie, even though it is like a very racist movie. So I can't excuse the racism in that movie. But like, it was one of the first movies that I was overwhelmed with the beauty of the landscape and how they used the location and how the location was so important in the movie. And I see that in the way that Tatooine was kind of presented, and like how you could see how remote they were and how everything was framed and how, like what part, what was lit, what was not lit. And I can't remember if it was George Lucas or if it was just another critic that was talking about The Searchers, but it was saying how it wasn't really about the violence. It was about the effect of the violence. And because I think a lot of people, if you look at The Searchers in Star Wars, like the whole scene of, Luke being drawn off and then coming back and finding Aunt Beru and Uncle Owen died, like they didn't show that, but they showed the effect that it had on Luke. And I think that was you can really tie that back to a direct scene in The Searchers. But I think that looking at it from that kind of like, you don't always have to show everything. Like sometimes you can come to something that happened afterwards and just see the effect of it. I think that kind of, those are interesting parallels to me.
Yeah, I think. Oh,
and the emotion that you get out of the characters based on that, like the Anakin scene, the revenge is so palpable in The Searchers, and we feel that with Hayden Christensen's performance and how similar those scenes are, and how much the emotions are at already turned up to 11. It's it's so well done. I totally agree with you. Also establishing shots, which is like my big passion thing about Star Wars, is I love knowing where we are and taking a look around for a little bit before we get into the action.
I think the racism though in the movie, not the meta racism of how like racist the production was with all the brown face and things like that, or the red face and things like that, but like the racism of Ethan's character, John Wayne's character in that movie, we're supposed to be applying our hatred for Ethan to Anakin as well because of his racism, essentially, with the Sand People as that stand-in for the Native Americans in there. And it makes me uncomfortable with those scenes in a way that I think I'm supposed to be uncomfortable.
Well, I think with the Searchers, it was uncomfortable to see John Wayne in a role that wasn't heroic. Even though he's really a jerk in a lot of movies, but like
in real life.
Like when you look at them now, you're just like, why was he popular? Okay. But in the Searchers, like he is not the hero. He is not a good man. He is a horrible man who is making horrible choices until like at the very, very end. And they kind of try to like make it be okay again. I'm like, not really. But I think that is the tension of that. And that is one of the main things that George Lucas had to deal with, is like, you have Anakin. He's a little boy. He's like, you have to make him, you want people to love him, but then you have to have them understand that he's going down a path that you should not follow.
Did anybody else want to jump in on this one? I think one of the others that I really loved was when I realized that Jar Jar was doing very specific bits from Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin movies. Like, knowing that Jar Jar is literally Charlie Chaplin.
Yeah.
It and Buster Keaton, like the moment where Jar Jar puts his foot in a battle droid and runs around and like shoots other people and messes things up, is like it's a shot for shot remake of a Buster Keaton bit where he's doing that. He's fending off pirates on a boat with a cannon. And it's like, maybe audiences were so divorced from silent film by 1999, it was harder to get that kind of stuff then, that they were just like, I don't understand this, but
I think George was going for physical comedy, right? And kids of that age loved it. Like, they loved Jar Jar. They loved the physical comedy. They loved the slapstick and, the farty jokes and stuff like that. So I think that George understood that, some jokes are timeless to kids that are in the Star Wars age, which is 8 to 12.
But it's interesting with humor because R2 and C-3PO, they aren't coming from humor from the generation, because I grew up in that generation. It was almost like a shift in George and not so much like a cinematic. It would be hard for people to capture the cinematic connection without knowing his connection to that material. Because for me as a kid, Star Wars is a little bit level above how I interacted and talked and what I thought of as funny. R2 and 3PO, to me, I was always like, oh, that's like my mom and dad when they get into it, when they fuss. Yeah. And so I think that's what shows where you don't know the connective tissue that the film is coming from, you have the reaction. The older I get and the more I watch The Phantom Menace, I see like this was my disconnect. It was never George's. The kids of that generation knew what he was doing. George knew what he was doing. Older Star Wars fans didn't. And just we either didn't search it out or didn't know that connective tissue.
George had little kids right at that age. Like, he knew what was funny and tried to make something funny for them.
Another one I wanted to talk about in this context is 2001 as well. I mean, George referenced 2001 a lot, whether it was in Phantom Menace with the 2001 lander in Watto's junk shop. But I think more specifically, again, that idea of like knowing 2001 and it kind of adding a little bit of, I don't know, that kick in the gut that 2001 kind of gives you at the end every time where you, I don't know, 2001 to me seems like the sort of religious experience that you have to like come to a new understanding with every time you watch it because you're always at a different stage in your life. But with the moment where they cut to the moon base in 2001, that sort of leads to that chain of events that brings us to the Star Child, right? Like the kid that's going to change the galaxy in the future or whatever. And George aped those shots completely, like beat for beat on Polis Massa, where Luke and Leia were going to be born. And so like the added, like if you know those shots from 2001 and then know how 2001 ends, it creates more emotional spark in those shots if you're applying that. And maybe that's just me reading too much into it, which could be. Like, I really love close reading movies, but maybe I've taken it too far.
I think 2001 also.
Only connection. Oh, go ahead. You go.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say the only thing I saw influencing that, and I think I saw 2001 quickly after Star Wars, is form and function. Everything in 2001, as far as you could magnify the dials on something and see that it was handwritten. It all has a purpose, and I think Star Wars has a lot of that too. But that's kind of the only shot. I never see those shot by shot comparisons. I always feel the emotions. So it's interesting how each of us has a different kind of DNA. I can't line up one shot from Star Wars with any other film except for fadeaways, of course. But I think it's all where your emotional element connects them, with your friendship.
For me, when I think of 2001, Star Wars, and like how are they connected, part of it is just like knowing that a spaceship flying through space can be beautiful, like that scene can be a work of art, and that there is no amount of detail that you can put into that ship that is not going to be embraced. And I think that was something that was kind of shocking about Star Wars, is that, I mean, from the very first, Imperial Star Destroyer shot, like that the detail of those ships and just taking time to show them in space was just really, it wasn't like, it really was just more majestic, and it really made you kind of take it more seriously as like a more serious story.
So I'm actually not going to talk about 2001 because I thought of another movie that doesn't exactly answer your prompt, but Dune, and the influences of the original novel on Star Wars as a whole, and especially the landscape of Tatooine and the racially coded natives that live there with the Sand people. And I think that's really interesting in how it kind of interplays, especially when you see the David Lynch's Dune come a little bit after Star Wars was such a huge hit. And the original Dune, the novel itself, is much more of like a high fantasy read on sci-fi. And it's really interesting to see how Star Wars influence actually came around back to David Lynch's film version of Dune, which felt more intensely sci-fi and more influenced by Star Wars itself. So it kind of became this weird self-fulfilling circle. And I think too, like the whole tenet of the savior, the prophesied savior that is talked about in Dune, it's played with less in the original trilogy and comes about more in Phantom Menace and the prequels too. So it's just kind of I think that the sequels like that, franchises like that kind of interweave and influence each other in both the book on the page and on the screen is really interesting. I know that doesn't answer your prompt at all, but I think that's a sort of an interesting thing to kind of bring into the conversation.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's why John Carter, right, is the same sort. It has the same sort of stuff where the books sort of influenced it, and then you watch the movie after and it's like, oh, like it looks like a Star Wars ripoff, even though it's adapted from source material that Star Wars ripped off way earlier. And I say ripped off lovingly. And interesting enough too about Dune, for those watching, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but like David Lynch had gone to do that after he'd turned down directing Return of the Jedi because the meeting gave him a headache and he just didn't want to do it. That was, if you haven't seen the video of David Lynch talking about turning down Return of the Jedi and the headache he got as George Lucas was breaking the story down for him, it's wonderful.
That's really funny because I feel like you would get more of a headache from just reading the synopsis for Dune.
Yeah.
So,
Well, Dune might be more weird, and and David Lynch is just like, hey, this is weird. I'm good. Another interesting Dune tie is the spice.
Yeah.
Like the spice mines at Kessel was like a specific reference to Dune, and that kind of carried all the way through to Solo.
And like how important it is as almost a secondary currency in the galaxy, something that's even more real when the government's like transition and everything like that. Like it is something that is used as a currency in the underworld. And I find that super interesting.
Another thing, I wanted to talk about everything, like we talk a lot about the classic trilogy and the prequel trilogy because those are sort of the things that George brought. I mean, he also worked on the cartoons, so Clone Wars has so much cinematic film influence. But everything sort of since then in the Disney era as well, the prequel trilogy, Solo, Rogue One, Rebels, Clone Wars, Resistance. I'm hoping we can talk about some of those things. Just to kick off the conversation, I would say I think my favorite episode, or one of my favorite episodes of Clone Wars, is called Senate Spy, and it's a 27-minute remake of Alfred Hitchcock's Notorious. For those who have never seen Notorious, it's basically Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman in a Hitchcock film where Cary Grant is sort of a spy handler, and he has to convince Ingrid Bergman to go fall in love with this ex-Nazi that was a friend of her father's to spy on him because they're reforming in Argentina. He's played by Claude Rains, really great actor. And they basically recast Anakin and Padme as Ingrid Bergman and Cary Grant. So the situation is that Padme has to go spy on this old flame that might be selling information to the Separatists, and then they make Anakin her bodyguard, and then he has to deal with all that jealousy of watching Padme interact with this guy, and it's so good. And it's not anything I would have expected in a kids cartoon. And it enabled me to, I got so excited talking about it with my son. Like, he was like, okay, I'll watch Notorious with you. And we got to watch Notorious for the first time. And I got to show him when he was like, I don't know, 13 or 14, because of that episode. So I'm curious, like talk about the newer era and the cartoons and the new movies.
I really like that the trench arc in Clone Wars is like Hunt for Red October. With submarine warfare and trying to find the hidden ship as they are trying to sneak past enemy lines. I really love the anxiety and how claustrophobic everything feels in that arc, specifically the episodes where they're like basically submarine versus battleship kind of feeling. But there is so many parallels. It's literally like Clone Wars was trying to pay homage to almost every type of genre that they could come across. And yeah, but that one in particular, I was like, oh, are they doing Hunt for Red October?
I kind of felt Last Jedi did the same thing too, right? With the Rebel fleet versus the Resistance fleet versus the First Order fleet. And that's why I never really understood the criticism like, oh, it's a slow boat chase. And I'm like, no, it's submarines. It's run silent, run deep. Like, yeah, that's what they're doing. I don't know. That was just me, but anybody else want to jump in?
With Ahsoka's arc, her final arc in season 5, that's like an education on what noir is. It's kind of beautiful. Like if you only have a subtle feeling, you're like, I don't know what noir is. And after watching that arc, if you go watch a noir film, you're like, this is very familiar. Why is this familiar? And I love how Dave Filoni knew that wasn't his wheelhouse. So he actually hired someone to write who came from that noir fan base, and you can just see it in every episode, the fact how, she's wrongly accused and she goes undercover and she has a partnership with someone you wouldn't expect her to, and also the emotion. She's a very angsty teenager in that. That's a concept of noir, like you feel like the world is on your shoulders. And then how they just totally pulled from the Tommy Lee Fugitive movie where she jumps and Anakin is standing there looking there. So that could make you a younger person who loves Clone Wars and wants to seek out the influences. That can lead them right to the noir genre, and they'd have so much fun with it. But that's kind of like textbook. This is how you do a noir film in an animated show. It's perfect.
So speaking of Dave Filoni, I wanted to talk, of course, about Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is where he kind of tested the grounds for what he would eventually accomplish with Clone Wars, Rebels, etc. And I actually came around to Avatar: The Last Airbender before a lot of Star Wars content, and it's really interesting how that series is very much in its broad narrative beats Star Wars, basically, but I like to describe it as how the Eastern mysticism and the Eastern influences in Star Wars is subtext that becomes text in Avatar: The Last Airbender. And it becomes this really interesting homage to those Eastern Oriental influences that Star Wars kind of touched upon with its pseudo-Japanese stylings, including the names and the clothes, and of course the influences of Akira Kurosawa, and turning that into a whole world, essentially. And if you're not familiar with Avatar: The Last Airbender, it's kind of a similar premise. There is a scrappy group of young protagonists who must save the world and lead a revolution against an evil empire. And in this case, it's the Avatar who is the reincarnation of the one person who has the ability to control all four elements. So in this world, people have the ability to control fire, earth, water, air through various martial arts forms. And the Avatar has the special ability to control all of them, but of course after various trainings with masters throughout the world. And the show follows him as he travels to different nations to master these elements and fights the Fire Lord, who is the ruler of this great evil empire, and sort of a stand-in for Japanese imperialism, and the one nation that upset the balance of the four nations by trying to conquer and colonize the rest of the world. So there's a lot of, I think especially the idea of behind the Force, and it being this sort of almost animistic, Shintoistic type of concept, the idea of there being balance. That is something that is very much in play in Avatar: The Last Airbender, the balance between the different chis, the good and evil. And it's so interesting to see that kind of played out in a different context, and where there's a world that only East Asian and Southeast Asian and Inuit cultures exist. And I think that actually in some cases, Avatar: The Last Airbender achieves some of what Star Wars ambitiously tries to achieve, even better. But I know I'm on a Star Wars panel and people will probably balk at that. But I do encourage anyone who is a Star Wars fan to try and to watch Avatar: The Last Airbender, because you get to see where Dave Filoni flexed his chops and see some of those more the subtextual parts of Star Wars turn into text again. So that's kind of my ploy for Avatar: The Last Airbender, and I hope I didn't derail the conversation too much.
Not at all. Not at all.
I'm going to second that. I just watched that series for the first time with my 10-year-old son, and he loved it. It is so I think that is true. What I was going to say is I revisited an article that J.J. Abrams was talking about what films and what filmmakers influenced The Force Awakens. And it had a lot of things that you might expect, like samurai films and Western films, things that inspired George Lucas. But he also mentioned the director Terrence Malick. And when he said that, I was immediately like, what, like, because if you're not familiar with Terrence Malick, he made movies like Badlands, Days of Heaven, Thin Red Line. They're long movies. They are slow moving. They don't have a lot of dialogue. They really use silence in a way that really, like, they're kind of like a love it or hate it kind of a thing. You have to kind of go along with it. For a lot of people, they're just like, it's just so slow, like what's going on? And I was thinking like, how could possibly that have affected J.J. Abrams when he was making, you know, like The Force Awakens? But it really makes me think of Rey's introduction. It's like an 8-minute sequence that is really unlike, I think, any other Star Wars sequence, where there's very little dialogue. It's very heavy on wide sweeping shots. And it's a very unique, you know, entry into like how you're going to get to know a character, especially a main character in Star Wars. And so that was something interesting, because I was familiar with Malick, but I wasn't familiar that J.J. Abrams was inspired by him at all. And so it's kind of interesting. Like, you can just go ahead and Google and see, you know, because filmmakers love to talk about this, like, because filmmakers want you to see everything. They want you to see everything. Like, you know, the more you love movies, the more you'll be, you know, wanting to see their movies. So I thought that was kind of, that was interesting to me. And I thought kind of gave me a different insight into J.J. Abrams.
The other movie he mentioned that kind of made me scratch my head until I went back to watch it, and I think it's for similar reasons, is when he started referencing Kurosawa films, he referenced High and Low, which is not anything I would instantly attach to Star Wars. It's about a shoe magnate who is just about to buy out the controlling interest in the company he's been working up for, and his son is kidnapped. And then he finds out it wasn't his, like, he gets ready to blow off the deal and pay the ransom, but then he finds out it wasn't his son, it was his chauffeur's son. And then he has to deal with the moral quandary of like, well, do I still need to, should I still pay the ransom? Like, he's not my kid anymore. And he ends up doing it. And I couldn't figure it out, but I think it was the stillness of the scenes in that same way of those Malick films that really helped JJ sort of like put sequences together where, especially with Kylo Ren, where they don't actually have to say anything. They can just appear and fill the frame and say things without actually saying anything.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's not the plot that really is inspiring them. It's like, how are you telling the story? Like, are you introducing a character by showing like a wide shot, a close-up of their face? Or are you, you know, having you hear them before you see them? Like, are you like starting, you know, a lot of Westerns will have very dramatic shots, but like they'll start with their boots and they'll kind of pan up and, you know, like, it's like, ooh, like this is a scary person. Like, you know, I think that how you use the camera, and also which we haven't really talked about, is how you use music in a film. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, I watched, you know, like the first 5 minutes of a whole bunch of films when I knew I was going to be on here. Didn't have a chance to watch all of them, but like Yojimbo has a very, very distinctive score. Like, for a guy that's like walking up and down a deserted, you know, street, like there is like very, very impressively, you know, like memorable music going through there. And I think that also can be a whole level of inspiration for filmmakers.
Definitely. I did want to bring up Legends of the Fall being a massive influence on The Last Jedi. It's talked about by the story group how the Space Bear, which was the production name for The Last Jedi, and they talk about how Luke was the Space Bear. And so, you know, Tristan in Legends of the Fall being like Ben and almost being cursed by this interaction with this bear from his childhood, which scars him and he scars the bear. And then they're set to have a date in the future where they have a final confrontation later on in the woods. And it's almost like there's a time limit to what has to happen. And this has to be resolved at some point. Even if they have confrontations, they need to actually have this resolved. And Tristan actually goes through a very dark arc, much like Ben Solo and Kylo Ren in you know, the sequel trilogy. And that comparison itself is just, I think, very beautiful.
With The Mandalorian Season 2 coming out like next month as you're watching this, I think it would be cool to talk about a little bit about that too. I mean, we know Yojimbo, you mentioned, Amy, is very much like the character that inspired Boba Fett, which sort of inspired the aesthetic of the Mandalorians, even though he's not Mandalorian. And then, which in turn inspired the Mandalorian, but also the aesthetic of like Lone Wolf and Cub, which was it's basically like 70s exploitation cinema, but Japanese style brought into the Mandalorian. So I'm wondering about even the more modern stuff where you're seeing the newer filmmakers that are coming into Star Wars, like Jon Favreau, bringing in new elements and influences that mesh with the influences that George Lucas had. And I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about that sort of stuff, if anybody wants to jump in.
I think the Wild Bunch is a good one for Mandalorian, like with the different like shootouts. And I know I've heard them talk about that. Another one of the movies I watched the first 5 minutes of was Once Upon a Time in the West, which I hadn't seen for a very long time. And I have to say that like there's a scene where there's a cowboy in a doorway and he's in shadow, bright light behind him. He's, look very imposing. And it is exactly like the shot of the Mandalorian coming into the cantina that has been on some of like the poster artwork. And I mean, I think that you can probably find that shot in a lot of things, but it was so on the nose that I was like, you just want to call up someone and be like, was it that? It seems like it was that, and then I think we talked about the Seven Samurai. I mean, chapter 4 of the Mandalorian, just like an episode of the Clone Wars was, I mean, essentially a retelling of the Seven Samurai. Which, it's a tale that, I think we'll get told all the time because it's a great, great story.
I loved what Deborah Chow brought to the whole series, like both of her episodes, but I especially loved that she brought in Hard Boiled, that influence that she had watched, as a kid with her dad. And she talks about it just beautifully in some interviews all about the background. And, again, it has that same like lone wolf and a cub, but, literally Chow Yun-fat is carrying the baby through these like gunfight and that especially the hallway scene as he's leaving, the client's facility. He's, it's like the shots are just so inspired by that movie. And I just love that she brought that cinema, and it is a very specific type of cinema into our Star Wars universe.
It's wonderful too because Lone Wolf and Cub has been adapted through many things, the manga, anime, but there's something that's really great about The Mandalorian is the collaborative aspect because the baby is very much, there's a lot of silence and witnessing that goes on with the child, which is very much the same from the manga because in the manga, the characters are their blood relatives, but his father distances himself emotionally from his son as he walks the path of vengeance. He basically says to a child, you have a choice. You can come with me or not. But he stops really being his father. And in The Mandalorian, each individual director gives us that silence and that communication of witnessing where the child is learning by watching things around him. And when you see the first episode of The Mandalorian with the baby's just tugging and tugging on him, and in the last episode where he just holds his hands out and the Mandalorian picks him up, you see there's a full arc in their interactions physically from the first episode to the last. And I just love the baby's silence and his witnessing. I can't wait for him to talk, but he says so much just with watching, just body.
Anyone else want to take this one on? Hui Chen?
No, everyone said beautifully, like everything that I feel like I had to say. So,
so we're running short on time, and one thing I want to do is, what movie would you recommend that if someone wants to get into classic cinema, and you're going to recommend a movie because they like Star Wars, what movie are you going to recommend to them and why? And what we can all pick different answers. And I will go last just so I don't take any of your answers.
All right, I'm going to be boring and I'm going to say The Searchers, which I've already talked about, but I do think that it's one of John Ford's masterpieces. It came later in his career. I think that there's a lot of character. There's a lot of like how you fill the scene, how you embrace the location. I think that there's just a variety of things that you can take from it. Also, like how important humor is, even if you're telling a very harsh story.
I'll go next, just because I love it so much. Metropolis, I think that it is one of the best movies to watch to understand class distinction and like ruling class versus rebels, and how do you overcome all of that too? It has a lot of themes of Star Wars and maybe executes some of them in a different way, which I appreciate, that it doesn't necessarily need to be Leave to War, just like Hidden Fortress as well. Kind of has a different ending than Everybody's Gotta Die or whatever. But also because of the, cyborg influenced ideas, there's a lot of that in there, as well as you get to see the machine and mensch, which is inspired Ralph McQuarrie to create the look for C-3PO.
There's so much Coruscant in there too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Just the overwhelming worldwide city that exists in Metropolis. And if you're really into 80s music, watch the extended colorized one with replacing the Beethoven with like 80s rock, including like Bonnie Tyler and like all of these amazing 80s bands.
I'm also going to be boring and say Seven Samurai. I think it's a perfect entryway to Akira Kurosawa's filmography. It's action-packed. It has the stories of the small, lesser off group of people rising up against a greater power after being unified and rallied by a group of leaders and who are somewhat flawed and only trying their best. And it really is just such a complete contrast to what you would expect from a foreign film and how brisk and modern and action-packed it is. And it's a masterpiece. So I think everyone should just watch Seven Samurai. So
I'm going to cheat a little. I guess some of the old serials were made into a film, but I have to say Flash Gordon is like the DNA of classic Star Wars, not only because of how things move and characters come together and the presence of the Empire and how the Darth Vader fills a room, but also because of the scroll. Because for those of us that had to live through wait times, the scroll was such an integral part of setting the mood for the film and giving us the information. And back then with serials, like you may not see a Flash Gordon for 5 weeks. So the scroll was integral in catching you up and reminding you where you left off. And every time I watch an old Flash Gordon or read a Flash Gordon comic, I can just imagine little George Lucas, just how that inspired his imagination and how it's wired into him. And you can just see more aspects of that the more you watch Flash Gordon.
I think too, I'm cheating and I'm going to do sort of a double feature, but I think two of the films that you need to understand Star Wars and the unique blend of everything that George Lucas was distilling into A New Hope that kicked off everything we're talking about is THX 1138 and American Graffiti. I think Dave Filoni's talked about this at times where he kind of said that THX is the Empire, right? And American Graffiti is the restless kids that are forced to fight against the Empire. And THX has so many technical things as far as the filmmaking and the way the audio is used, the way they build the audio generally. I think people underestimate how much Walter Murch and his work on THX influenced George Lucas for the rest of his career in the way sound is used in Star Wars, not just Ben Burtt's work, but just sort of like what George Lucas directed him to do. And then American Graffiti is such an innocent sort of pure look at characters that are just really fun. And there's this fun that permeates Star Wars that kind of comes out through American Graffiti, but also the ability to tell a story that feels like it might meander with a whole bunch of different protagonists that comes to a point that helps you like understand something about yourself and the world around you by the end. And George Lucas just put those two in a blender with all of his other influences, with everything else you all talked about, and then that's how we got A New Hope. I think A New Hope is like a miracle of a movie, and George Lucas is probably the only person who could have put it together with all of the unique interests he had in cinema, in life, and everything. And I think THX and American Graffiti are the way to really understand that in a way that I think a lot of people don't necessarily pay attention to as much as I think they should.
I love that you mentioned Walter Murch, because like back to 2187, that influenced both of them from a sound design perspective, both George and him. And it's a very short film, and you can find it out there on the internet right now. I think it's free because of the Government of Canada Film Board it's just on their YouTube. Yeah, it's just on their YouTube. So I recommend everybody, it's only like 9 minutes long. Go and check it out. 2187 is like fundamental for understanding George, and it has a beautiful Force reference in there as well.
Yeah, no, and I mean, just on the surface, like FN 2187, 2187, like it's throughout
Star Wars and everything he does.
Video in there, you'll see the audio, like that movie's just.
You'll see
great.
The burning homestead, like burning bodies, like it's weird and wonderful and very George. And I think that he was like, yeah, I want to make something that makes an impact like this.
So to close out, can each of you take a turn telling people where they can find you and your work, just to remind them?
So you can find me, I have a website, 365starwars.com, and you can find me on Twitter, Amy at Amy Rickow, or the site has at 365_Star Wars.
You can find me writing at /film.com, and I'm on Twitter at htranbui.
I'm mostly on Twitter at Yogi Kai, and on the Fangirls Going Rogue Twitter a lot. And anything I write or involved in, I share it through there.
And my personal Twitter is Marie C. Gould, and you can find me at What the Force Podcast or whattheforce.ca if you want to check out anything that I've already talked about, or of course, cinematic parallels that we discuss with Amy Rickow, who's also on this panel.
For me, you can find me at the Full of Sith podcast, or my writings about Star Wars at sci-fi/film, StarWars.com, Star Wars Insider. Pretty much anybody who will let me write about Star Wars, I'll go write about Star Wars for them. And then you can follow me on Twitter at Swankmotron, or visit me at swankmotron.com. And that's it for me. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to record this panel with me for DragonCon, DragonCon's virtual event. I love having conversations about Star Wars and cinema, especially with people that are as passionate and knowledgeable about it as I pretend to be, or hope I appear to be, at least. So thank you all so much